biogeography and macroecology. So please post your questions in the live chat. So you can use the chat here, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So first I will read out the questions we got in the discussion forum. We got only one question in the discussion forum regarding biogeography. That is for Umesh.
I think that's for Robin.
Sorry?
In the discussion forum, the question is for Robin.
Sorry.
In
That
the
is
response sheet.
like response sheet, yeah. So for macroecology, I got one question in the discussion forum. But in the live response sheet, that is question for Robin. Yeah.
Oh, can you just paste the macroecology question in the chat box, please, Amrita?
Yeah, I'm just doing that. Yeah, this is the question.
Yes. So, when the tropics say the sword-billed hummingbird loses its niche, then chances of it going extinct is more since it's dependent on a particular food source versus. That's true. Specialist species are often the first to go extinct, um, because they're specialist and they're dependent on very specific resources, and so um, uh, you know as long as the climate remains stable and relatively aseasonal and the resources available, the species can persist, the specialist species can persist. But the moment, you know, um, resource levels come down, or the moment that resource disappears or any disturbance comes into the system, it will be the specialist species that tend to go extinct. Um, so yes, it's true that the short-billed hummingbird, because it's got such a narrow niche, it's going to be very vulnerable to extinction. There's another one, which is a tropical South American hummingbird show extreme bill specialization for specific flowers. Yes. Do Asian hornbills show similar specializations since they are omnivorous? Is their bill a compromise between a fruit reaching tool and a hunting weapon? So the degree of omnivory varies across hornbill species, some species, and it varies seasonally also. First of all, some species are largely frugivorous with very little feeding on things like small reptiles, lizards, snakes, whereas other species tend to be quite carnivorous. And they tend to be quite carnivorous during the breeding season when there's this protein requirement for raising young, and so they tend to feed more on uh, um, reptiles, even small mammals during that season. So yeah, I would imagine that the bill is sort of it's not a highly specialized bill. Yes, it's definitely a fruit reaching a bill, because it uses, like the toucan uses the long reach of the bill to reach for fruit in trees. But also, I suppose the bill has to be suitable for taking other kinds of food also. So it's not become a very specialized uh, shape. It's long, but it's not a specialized shape to the extent that you would see with hummingbirds in South America.
Yeah. If you have any question related to macroecology lecture, please post your questions, or else you can unmute and ask.
Is Robin here?
No, I think he didn't join. Uh, he said he will join in few minutes, like he's traveling, but he said he'll join. Yeah.
So there's another question in the chat box from Maniatis, which is that in the Himalayas and the Western Ghats, bird diversity is often highest at more elevations. Is this true for hornbills as well? If most fruit trees grow in the lowlands, then why wouldn't the most hornbill species be found at the very bottom of the mark? In fact, that's true. It's true that tree species richness and fruiting species richness is highest at the lowest elevations, and correspondingly, hornbill diversity is also highest at lower elevations. So, if you look at the base of the eastern Himalayas, for example, you tend to have at the lowlands great hornbill, oriental pied hornbill, a wreathed hornbill, brown hornbill. These are all lowland species. There's only one species that actually um, is resident year round at relatively higher elevations, and that's the rufous necked hornbill. So it depends on the diet of the bird. Definitely, whether species richness is high at mid elevations or at low elevations. Insectivores tend to have higher species richness at mid elevations in the Himalayas and the Western Ghats. And because most birds are insectivores, it's the insectivores that are driving the overall biodiversity pattern across an elevational gradient. And so, even though you have frugivores that go, high elevation at high species richness at low elevation and lower species richness as you move up, that pattern gets sort of dampened because there are so many more insectivores in the community, and the insectivores peak in species richness at mid elevations. Now, that's not true in all mountain ranges. In South America, in North America, in Eurasia, I mean the higher latitudes in Europe and Asia, you actually see higher species richness of all groups, regardless of what they eat, at the base of the mountain. And as you go higher up, species richness comes down. It's only in a certain set of mountain ranges that you see the mid elevation species richness peak, and that's mostly in Africa, Asia, tropical Asia, and then Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Hi, Robin.
Hi. Sorry, I was, got a little late joining.
No worries. I think Umesh answered few questions. So Robin, can I read out the question?
Yeah, sure.
Hello. Yeah. So in dispersal ability, you said that understory bird species have more genetic diversion compared to canopy birds. Please explain how and why.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is one of those generalized statements. I mean, you'll always find exceptions, but as a generalized statement, what it means is that um, the ecology of species often has evolutionary consequences. So if you think about how species move, canopy frugivores particularly track resources, and they move a lot, and hence because they move a lot, then their genetic differentiation is low. On the contrary, understory birds are kind of, they're insectivores. I mean, understory insectivores. They hold territories and they don't move much, and hence they tend to be more kind of genetically divergent. But this is a broad generalization. I mean, I don't think you can if you go through a list of species, you will find exceptions very quickly. But the pointed wing, I don't know if that comes as part of that, but how pointed a wing is, that is definitely a very good trait as far as traits go. Basically, the food habits is one trait, but you can also have other traits like, and in that set, the the hand to wing index, or how, sorry, not hand to wing, if you take the primary and secondary the feathers, so how pointed the wing is. And the more pointed, the longer the primary is compared to the secondary, the more dispersal ability it has, and hence less genetically differentiated it would be. But small birds with rounded wings tend to have low dispersal ability and hence are more genetically differentiated. I hope that was confusing enough to not have more questions on that.
Yeah, actually, Shruti have asked a question and she's okay with that.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
So yeah, there is a question to Umesh.
Yeah, I have a question in the chat group, which is could hummingbirds survive in Asia? Because the habitat has plenty of nectar, similar to where sunbirds live. I would imagine the answer to that question is yes. And like Robin, related to what Robin was talking about, is dispersal ability. Um, you know, um, a lot of the reason why we see patterns of geographical distribution of species on Earth today is because either species are very good at dispersing or there are species that are very poor at dispersing. Poor dispersers will tend to have smaller ranges, geographic ranges. And so if you picked up a bunch of hummingbirds from South America and you brought them to India and you released them in the Western Ghats, which has lots of flowers, unless they're super specialized and they feed on only one kind of flower, that like the short-billed hummingbird requires flowers that have long corollas. Maybe those kinds of flowers have not evolved in Asia, you know. But if the hummingbird species is not super specialized, diet its dietary components and its dietary components are available, then I would imagine that it would very much definitely be able to survive in Asia um, as well. And a good example of that is the way in which we have spread invasive species across the world, right? There are many species, for example, that wouldn't have made it to Australia from Asia because it's too far for them to fly to Australia. But we have moved them, either inadvertently or deliberately, moved them. And so we have increased their dispersal ability in some artificially in some sense, right? Their innate dispersal ability is not high, but we have now increased their dispersal ability by transporting them by ship or air or whatever it is to this new location. And you do see a significant fraction of species that are moved to non-native habitats get established there as invasive species. So, but those species also tend to be more generalist. They are not as specialist as something like a hummingbird. But I would imagine that a generalist hummingbird should be able to establish if moved in sufficient numbers, unless there are things like diseases and stuff like that that will kill off those populations because they're susceptible to them and so on. But yeah, we've shown with invasive species that you can move species to other locations and they will establish. Um, Austin has welcome. Austin has a question, which is that when two species with the same or highly similar niches collide in the same habitat, what determines which species grows dominant or they slowly adapt to different niches to reduce competition? Um, the There is a law called Gauss's law, which is also called the principle of competitive exclusion, which states that complete competitors cannot coexist. Now, it's a very vaguely worded law, but it basically says if you've got two species that are identical in resource use, then one species will drive the other to extinction. Now, um, there have been several criticisms of this as well. If two species are exactly identical in their resource use, wouldn't they also be sort of similar in their competitive ability? Why would one be dominant over the other kind of thinking? But generally, um one species, either because of something very deterministic or even random. For example, two species that have same population sizes and exactly the same niches now are in the same habitat, right? Something happens a disease maybe, right, breaks out in one species, and the population size of that species comes down, then the other species might be able to, overcome, to drive the other species extinct, and then become the only species in that habitat, utilizing that niche. The other alternative, like you point out, is that somehow niches have to be, niche divergence has to happen in their niches, so that now they compete less, and because they compete less, they're able to coexist in that habitat. You see this often in mountain birds. You see, for example, let's look at sunbirds, right? Sunbirds are feeding on nectar, but there's a very predictable. You go to the lower elevations, there's one species of sunbird. At 1800 meters, it's replaced by another species of sunbird. At 2400 meters, it's replaced by another species of sunbird. So as you go higher and higher up in elevation, what these sunbirds, you know, what seems to have happened, we can't tell for sure. What seems to have happened is that they diverge in their niches in terms of elevation. So although they're all feeding on nectar, they're now avoiding competition by being at different elevations and not coexisting at the same elevation. You see that with many other groups of mountain birds. Um, so yeah, the outcomes are either competitive exclusion or divergence, niche differentiation between the two species. Um, Robin, is this for you? The narcomouse hornbill is genetically very similar to the mainland species, but looks so physically different. Does this suggest that selection pressure on tiny volcanic islands is much faster than the rate of neutral genetic mutations?
Sorry, Umesh, where are you reading this from?
This is in the chat box.
It's in the chat box, Robin.
Okay, just hold on. Let me just take a look.
This is the last question asked in the chat box. I can read out for you.
Selection pressure is much faster. I don't understand that. Can you just unmute and ask the question? Or Umesh, did you understand what's happening?
The narcomouse hornbill. You mean the question, Robin?
Because it looks different, but they're genetically different. No, genetically similar, but they look different.
If the narcomouse hornbill is genetically very similar to the mainland species, but looks so physically different. Actually, the narcomouse hornbill's closest relative is the Papuan hornbill, which is found on the island of Papua New Guinea, and it looks very similar to the Papuan hornbill actually. So genetically, those two species are sister species, the Papuan hornbill and the Narcondam hornbill, and they actually look very similar to each other.
So I don't think, I think we consider them as species, but there's not, that's still up for debate. But I'm not sure. Did you mean something else, the person who asked the question?
He says, they say that mic is broken.
But you can type in the chat what, like.
Well, generally for many species, selective pressure is lower in islands than on mainlands, because many islands don't have predators, for example, right? And therefore, you see a lot of flightless birds on islands, on small islands, because those small islands historically had predators, and therefore there was no need to evolve something as develop something as expensive as the ability to fly. And so therefore you'll find things like the dodo and the solitaire and all of these species that actually have come about as the result of lower selective pressure on islands than on the mainland, with things like predation.
Yeah, and the more common pattern is that they morphologically but are genetically and there are a lot of examples where the opposite happens, where they are genetically similar, but there is morphological difference. But that is mostly in very specific things, like it may be in plumage, or it may be in build shape or something like that. I mean, even many of the Darwin's finches are actually not genetically that divergent, and that is because of kind of those adaptation at particular loci in the genome. So that can happen, and that may be the closest to what you are alluding to, I think.
Welcome to the clarification in the chat box. Does that mean that natural selection on a tiny island works much faster than the random ticking of DNA mutations?
But sorry, I have to read it. Doesn't mean a natural selection or entirely. No. I think this is like that's not like, so natural selection is a broad umbrella, and I think what you're talking about is selection. So I wonder if we had this somewhere in our class, in any of the lectures. Um, uh, Directional selection and all that. I'm getting confused with the class that I teach at ICER versus what this has.
Yeah.
So I would suggest, the person who asked the question to just look up directional selection, and that might answer the question. There are some nice, cartoons also that show different kinds of selection, and that might help understand that.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things to point out is that islands on tiny volcanic islands, you're going to have small population sizes of these species, right? And if you have a large population with lots of gene flow going on between individuals in that population, and it's a large population with a huge range, um, um, changes to the genetic makeup of that population will be slower than changes to the genetic makeup of a population that is small, and that's because of drift, random mutation. Um, yeah, so small populations are vulnerable to that kind of. But that's a property of small populations, not necessarily of populations on volcanic islands, of all small populations.
So there is a question in the discussion forum to Robin. When you discussed the extinction, so what are the alpha and beta species? This is question from Sakshi. Yeah.
What is the alpha and beta species?
Yeah. Alpha,
What is it?
beta
I mean,
species.
alpha and like, what? Can you give me some context? Hey,
So
Umesh,
this
you
is
know about
the
alpha and beta species?
so this is a pinned question from the where you talk about the extinction of extinction, the end of biogeography. I don't know.
Oh God. Is the person there on online?
Let me check. Sakshi.
Sakshi, can
No.
you please explain the question a little bit? I mean, I am not able to get the context of this. Alpha and beta species
Yeah,
in
she just
extinction.
asked only that. Yes.
I can't.
Okay.
I can't fathom
So
what this is. Uh, Umesh, consider this as a call a friend time. Any idea?
um, Case study previously. Is it the conservation case studies? Because oh, or is that Mansi's lecture?
Okay, Shruti is asking, is there an anthropogenic impact on species evolving rather rapidly? For example, cascades of hornbill would eventually become smaller or disappear altogether if hunting continues. I'm connecting this to the case study of elephants in Mozambique's Gorosanga National Park that were born without tusks in response to the mass poaching, according to a study. Yeah, this is Mansi's case study. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there are evolutionary consequences to all of these things. Hunting, especially because hunters target, the largest and the most spectacular individuals in the population, right? If you're a hunter and and this happens in Africa now, where it's commercialized hunting, where you can pay $50,000 and shoot a lion or shoot an elephant, and for the hunters, the motivation is to get the biggest lion or the biggest elephant, right, with the most magnificent tusks. And so what you do in that population is that you're removing the high quality. Let's say we're hunting lions, male lions and male elephants, right? You're removing the high quality individuals from that population. That does two things. One is the genetic makeup of the population changes, where the high quality fittest individuals are taken out of the population. One. The second thing that happens is, now that the biggest males are no longer around in the population, there's no reason for the other males to evolve to become very, very big, because there's no competition from other big males anymore, right? So let's say there's elephants higher than 5.5 tons, higher than 5 tons males have been removed from the population. Then there's no evolutionary incentive for the other males in the population to grow beyond 5 tons or beyond 5.5 tons, because they don't need to fight other big males because they've been removed from the population. So yeah, it's definitely possible that hunting could cause similar things even for species like hornbills. Um, but would the casks eventually become smaller or disappear altogether if hunting continues? Um,
I
Tough
can
to
answer that.
say.
Yeah.
Robin, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, especially because there's one question that I can answer. So one thing that's cool about evolution is that it's unpredictable. So that's why it's easy to answer that. That you can never say what will happen in the future because of how things change. So the direction can probably never be predicted.
Right, right. Um, so with the alpha and beta species, the previous question,
No,
I
that
think
is
it might be
from
to do with.
Sakshi.
Right, yes, yes. What was
Yeah.
the question exactly? Can you paste it, please, Amrita? Because I can't hear very well after losing my hearing from
Yeah, yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, I'll just paste the question.
What are alpha and beta species? I thought I heard that. Yeah, I did hear what are alpha and beta species. I think this might be referring to alpha and beta diversity, because that's definitely something we've not.
Yeah. It
The,
may be
the,
that, but how does it connect to extinction in any case? I
oh
couldn't
no, I
connect
think
all of those.
So she asked this question in the, where Robin explains extinction slide. So this is in the discussion forum, like where they can pin where they want to ask question.
And they pinned it to this biogeography and extinction. I don't understand that part.
So there is another question to Robin. I'm just pasting it here. The species
Yeah,
richness
I think
decreases.
yeah, that was a mistake.
Okay.
between what I said and what is on the slide. The east and west.
Yeah.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
So this is another question that she's from the same person, Sakshi. She's not unable to search Solicola as Ashambuensis on eBird.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we have to ask eBird for that. But um, so yeah, why not? Why not talk about that? Actually, the if you look at the bird life now, I think there is an Ashambuensis subspecies. So essentially, people who work on evolution, especially with phylogenetics, I mean, they just see if populations are different within a species or not. And if you look at that, there's 2 million years of divergence between the Ashambu and the northern one. So, so for taxonomists, I mean, for some species that is, for some people that's a species, and for some people it is not because they appear very similar. So they probably waiting to get more evidence, which I'm not sure how that'll happen. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people who are interested in this to look at the species concept because there are so many concepts of what a species is, right? And for what is two different species for one person, like Robin is saying, could be considered to another person the same species. So yeah. Um, I think there's a question for me, which is if high predation in the tropics helps more species living together by keeping their populations low, do hornbills help maintain forest diversity by acting as predators of smaller birds and lizards? Uh, so that's a hypothesis, right? The so questions in biogeography can often be tested. Questions in macroecology often are untestable because you can come up with a hypothesis in macroecology. For example, you could say um, it's ants and competition with ants that causes bird diversity to vary across an elevational gradient. But if you have to test that hypothesis, you'd have to do things like remove the ants and see whether competition comes down. And those sorts of things are either impossible to do, unethical to do, or illegal to do. So you can't really test many of these questions in macroecology. And the other reason is, we have only one Earth, right? You're looking at patterns of species richness and diversity on the Earth. Whereas if the Big Bang happened again and the trajectory of evolution was different, the trajectory of how species came about on Earth was different and the land masses looked different, then we might have had very different patterns on that in that alternative scenario. So we don't know what the counterfactual is. But this high predation, keeping populations low enough so that they don't outright become big enough to competitively exclude each other, it's a hypothesis. It could be plausible that a species that feeds on smaller birds and smaller mammals is doing this, is maintaining high diversity by keeping those populations low, is plausible. Unfortunately, very, very difficult to test. So it remains a hypothesis. You can just say there's evidence consistent with that hypothesis, but this particular hypothesis would be very, very, I would imagine, given given our situation right now with science and so on, and the history of the earth and everything, this would be an almost impossible hypothesis to test. But it's plausible.
Are there any questions? Please post. Otherwise, we'll end up the session in 5 minutes. If there is no
I just wanted to add in response to Miniatison's question is that again, there's a lot of back and forth and disagreements within scientific subthemes. So if I come up with a hypothesis that I find very plausible, that doesn't necessarily mean that Robin has to agree with me, right? That other scientists have to agree with me, and that's the process of science. It's built. You build evidence and so on, and then you test these hypotheses and counter hypotheses and so on. So. Especially in macroecology, when you find patterns that are consistent with certain hypotheses, um, that doesn't necessarily mean that that hypothesis is true. Just wanted to end up.
Yeah, Sakshita just joined. Sakshita, do you want to ask your question? Like, Robin is here. He didn't get your
Alpha,
question
beta.
exactly in what context.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
alpha, beta species. Yeah. In what
Yeah,
context you asked? Yeah, please.
the context was it was the temperature and precipitation graph, and like there were 4 points on it, like the gradient changes in productivity and community structure decreases. And then third point was alpha and beta species diversities decrease from favorable to extreme environments. I don't know what alpha and beta species diversity.
I think that's Mansi's. Was that from Mansi's work?
This is from the biogeography lecture.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, Umesh, if you know this, please jump in. I don't remember this slide. I'll have to look at it actually, but I can
I,
look at
I
it and respond also if. But Umesh, yeah, if you have any ready answers.
sure. Sakshita, can you tell us what slide this was exactly? What was the study on?
Yes, I've
Because
sent the link and the timestamp on chat.
oh yeah, okay.
So your other two questions got answered. One was one is a mistake where you got confusion. And
Right.
yeah, you watched the
Sorry,
recorded
I joined
session. You'll
late.
get, yeah.
Yeah, I'll check
No
that.
worries. Sure.
Yeah, this might be to do with alpha diversity and beta diversity rather than alpha species and beta species. Uh, I myself am not familiar with the terms alpha species and beta species, but there's definitely something in macroecology and biogeography called alpha diversity and beta diversity. Alpha diversity is the total, commonly measured as the total species richness of a community at any point. So, for example, if I went to the Western Ghats and I went to 1 hectare size plot in Maharashtra and I counted, how many bird species are there on that plot, that would be the alpha diversity of that particular plot. Then, if I went to Karnataka and I redid that in another plot and I counted the number of species in that second plot, that would be the alpha diversity of the second plot. So now you have two alpha diversities. You have one alpha diversity of the first plot in Maharashtra and you have another alpha diversity of the second plot in Karnataka. So alpha diversity is point diversity at a particular point in space and time, not exactly a point, but some sample in space and time. What is the diversity of species that you see? Beta diversity is the difference in the species diversity between those two alpha diversities. So if Karnataka has 40 species of birds and Maharashtra has 20 species of birds, then commonly beta diversity would be, I, I'm just sort of saying this very loosely. Don't quote me on this. It's not an exact definition, but it's basically beta diversity is the difference in alpha diversity between two locations. So if two locations have exactly the same species, beta diversity would be zero. If two locations have no shared species, then beta diversity would be very, very high. Right.
Yeah,
So think of beta diversity. Sorry, Robin, go ahead.
no, I was saying that I was not able to find that spot at that with that reference anyway. So yeah, I think Umesh, your description sounds probably the best. And with environmental variation, I suppose the greater the variation, the greater the beta diversity would be, because if the locations are environmentally something about environmental variation, if I remember right. So environmentally similar, biogeographically in the same realm, then it can have that 52. Okay, I'll check 52.
Yeah, sorry, I think the timestamp was wrong.
Do any of you have any questions? If no questions, we'll wind up the session. You can post a question in the discussion forum. Any of you have any questions, please post. So I hope there is no question. So in that case, we'll wind up. Thank you, Umesh. Thank you, Robin, for joining in. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, if you have any question, please post in the discussion forum. I can always reach out to professors and then send back the answers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you so
So that,
much.
yeah, thanks. And
Yeah.
you can just get in touch, maybe share my details with, the person who had this question, then I can get back a little
Yes.
bit after.
Sure.
Because
Yes,
it
please.
seems like it's a Whittaker plot. So
Yeah.
Whittaker plot, yeah. So Whittaker plot just has basically communities that are, that are at different precipitation and temperature. So temperature and precipitation, just that two axis, environmental variable axis, can predict the habitats. So that's what the Whittaker plot does. So it tells you where, let's say, the rainforest is. So that's the wet and warm areas and things like that. So I'm not sure if I said alpha and beta. Maybe I missaid it. But essentially, the Whittaker plot, what it does is just using two variables, you can predict what kind of habitat a place has. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, I got the plot, but on the slide itself, if you see the third point, that's the one I was asking about.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm kind of juggling this, so I can't.
Yeah, no worries. Maybe you could get back to me on the forum itself.
Yeah, so my guess is that if I've said anything about beta diversity with the Whittaker plot, it's just that the diversity would be more if you go across the gradient. Yeah, but anyway, let me look at it and then I'll get back to you on the forum.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Umesh, and thanks, Robin.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks,
everyone.
Umesh. Yeah, and thanks.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for joining. See you.
So
Bye.
we'll see next week, 11, Umesh's lecture on avian conservation. The dates will be announced in the portal. Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye, everyone.